The 18th floor boardroom at Davenport Price and Company was everything it was designed to be. Cold, commanding, and white. Bleached oak panels framed the long conference table like a museum display, and full-glass walls revealed a city skyline dusted in snow. Minneapolis shimmered outside, quiet and frozen. But inside, the temperature was something else entirely. Every seat around the table was taken. Executives in charcoal suits, silver watches, polished voices. Near the end of the table, a young black woman sat still, nearly invisible, just as some of them preferred her to be. Imani Russell kept her eyes forward, her hands folded on a plain notepad. The nameplate in front of her read, Assistant Analyst. A role no one bothered to question. Her gray turtleneck and slacks were clean but unassuming, chosen deliberately to fade. She had sat in that room before countless times, but today the energy was different. It wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. Too many side glances. Too much silence before her name was mentioned. Across the table, Gregory T. Maddox, CEO, co-founder, guardian of the firm's legacy, shifted in his seat. His voice, when it came, was velvet-covered steel. "Ms. Russell," he said, enunciating the name with exaggerated courtesy. "Thank you for joining us. I understand you weren't scheduled for this morning's discussion, but I assume you know why you're here." Imani nodded once. Her expression didn't change. "I do," she said simply. Maddox gave a soft chuckle, the kind men like him had mastered. Condescending, indulgent, just this side of polite. "Good. Then I'll spare the preamble. We've conducted a review of your department's operational records. There are a few inconsistencies, miscommunications, perhaps, but we believe a change in personnel would serve the firm's long-term integrity." A few heads nodded, not looking at her but toward Maddox. Only Laura Chan, the general counsel, glanced briefly in Imani's direction, her brows tightening ever so slightly. Imani blinked once, then leaned in slightly. "If I may ask, Mr. Maddox, what exactly are these inconsistencies?" He smiled wider now, like a professor indulging a slow student. "Don't worry about the details, dear. It's less about numbers and more about fit, culture, direction. You know how important those are to us." And there it was, the real reason floating right above the table in plain sight. Not performance, not results, just culture, direction, fit. The silent expectation that Imani should be somewhere else, anywhere else, somewhere more community-facing. She didn't flinch, didn't look around the room to see who agreed or stayed quiet. She just asked, calm as ever, "Will I be given an opportunity to respond?" Gregory Maddox shrugged. "You're welcome to, of course. But as I said, the decision's already been made." There was a folder in front of him, thick with papers he hadn't opened. He placed a manicured hand on top of it. "HR will follow up with the standard release package. And of course, we'll ensure the transition is as smooth as possible. I trust that's acceptable." Silence filled the room. It wasn't tense, it was practiced, sanitized. The kind of silence that institutions use to protect themselves while dismantling someone quietly. Imani waited a breath longer. Then, gently, she reached into the canvas bag at her feet. Across the table, Maddox stiffened. Not visibly, but enough for Charles Halvorson to glance up. Laura Chun turned her head fully now, watching with interest as Imani pulled out a thick navy blue folder. Not the kind HR used. This one was embossed with a small silver seal on the bottom right corner. Few people in that room recognized it, but Maddox did. His smile dimmed by a millimeter. Imani placed the folder in front of her, not pushing it forward, not making a scene, just letting it rest between them. "I'd like to place this on the record before we proceed," she said. No one moved. No one spoke. And for the first time since she had walked into that boardroom, someone other than Imani began to wonder what she was really doing there. Gregory Maddox didn't reach for the folder. He kept his hand on his own, still perched like a final word that hadn't yet been spoken. His eyes held steady, but his tone shifted, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Russell," he said slower now. "This meeting was meant to be brief. I'm not sure what you think you're doing, but I suggest you reconsider. Imani didn't blink. This won't take long. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. But if this meeting is going on the record, then this needs to be part of it. She pushed the folder forward. Just a few inches, but far enough. Maddox exhaled through his nose. He didn't look down. Instead, he turned toward Laurachin. Counsel, would you mind advising this team member that we've already followed protocol? Laura didn't speak immediately. She glanced at the seal on the folder, then looked at Imani. Ms. Russell, she said carefully, do you mind clarifying what this is? Imani didn't move. It's a formal disclosure packet compiled under federal ethics oversight. Everything in there is time-stamped, internally sourced, and corroborated. Now the room began to shift. Small movements, shoulders tightening, eyes flicking sideways, pens being set down. The polish in the room started to crack, just enough to reveal the surface tension underneath. Charles Halvorson adjusted his tie. Corroborated by whom? Imani turned her eyes toward him. The U.S. Treasury Enforcement Office and the Federal Financial Ethics Bureau. Their joint review began 14 weeks ago. Gregory Maddox gave a tight laugh, one note, empty. You expect us to believe that you, a junior analyst, managed to coordinate a federal audit? I didn't coordinate it, she said evenly. I was placed here to observe, quietly, until enough internal anomalies triggered phase 2. For the first time, Maddox leaned back. Not far, but enough to show he'd registered the shift. He reached for the blue folder with 2 fingers, opened it without looking down, and paused. Page 1. A cover sheet from the FFEB. Page 2. Summary of misappropriated disbursements tied to shell consultancies. Page 3. Internal emails, his emails. The room fell still again. Laurachin reached across to see more clearly. She pulled the folder closer and began flipping, her lips tightening as she read. Maddox didn't stop her. His fingers curled slightly on the table. Let's be careful here, he said slowly. There's a protocol for how these things are handled. You can't just ambush a leadership team. This isn't an ambush, Imani said. This is accountability, and it's already in motion. Her words weren't loud, but they landed hard. Halvorson sat straighter now, glancing at Laura. She didn't look up. One of the other board members, a younger man whose name Imani hadn't needed to know until now, whispered something under his breath. Gregory's tone sharpened. Do you understand what you're risking? Careers, reputations, your own future. Imani met his gaze. No, Mr. Maddox. What I understand is how systems like this survive. They rely on silence. They thrive on fear. But I didn't come here to survive this system. I came here to expose it. Silence again. This time deeper. Not practiced. Not controlled. Just raw. Laura closed the folder and folded her hands. Her voice was steady. Gregory, this is serious. If half of this holds, it's not just a compliance issue. It's federal. He opened his mouth but said nothing. Then he turned to Charles. We don't act on hearsay. Charles didn't speak. Imani stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. But her presence filled the room in a way that made Maddox's chair feel just a little too large, and him a little too small. I've done my part, she said. What you choose to do next is up to you. But I promise, inaction is no longer an option. She didn't leave. She didn't sit. She waited. And across the long expanse of table, the architecture of power, so meticulously built, so confidently wielded, began to tremble in the quiet. Gregory Maddox adjusted his cufflinks, more out of habit than necessity. The room had shifted, and he could feel it, like a current breaking against a seawall. Still, he leaned back with practiced ease, his voice regaining that familiar tone of command. Let's not turn this into theater, he said. Whatever this initiative is, it's clearly misguided. You've been misinformed, Ms. Russell. Perhaps even used. He looked to the others, seeking consensus, reassurance, anything. It happens. Good people get caught up in bad channels. But this isn't how we handle things here. No one spoke. No one nodded. Even Charles Halvorsen, usually the first to echo, kept his gaze downward. Laura Chen's fingers tapped lightly on the folder. She wasn't reading anymore. She was waiting. Imani didn't move. Her voice remained quiet, measured. No one used me. I volunteered. She paused. What I witnessed over the last year wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was structured, intentional, rehearsed. I didn't collect gossip. I followed paper trails, verified identities, traced reimbursements back to ghost firms that didn't exist before this board-approved discretionary spending authority last spring. She took a breath, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. And I know that none of it would have mattered unless I brought it into this room, today, in front of everyone who helped normalize it. Maddox tilted his head, a forced smile forming. You've clearly prepared a narrative. But if you think undermining this firm's leadership will make you a hero, I'd advise caution. These kinds of accusations carry consequences. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed. If you cared about this company, you would have come to me first. Privately. I did, Imani said. The words cut through the space between them. 8 months ago, I submitted a flagged compliance review directly to your office. It never made it past your executive assistant. She looked at him evenly. 3 weeks later, the internal audit team was reassigned. My access to budget tracking was revoked. That's when I filed with the FFEB. Maddox blinked. Once. Slowly. Laura turned to him. You didn't tell us that, she said, her voice low. Someone else shifted in their chair. Reuben Stokes, silent until now, but listening closely, folded his arms. His eyes never left Imani. There was no shock on his face, no curiosity, just recognition, as if he had seen something like this before, maybe too many times. He didn't speak, but the stillness around him changed, spread. Maddox straightened again, clearing his throat. This firm has survived market crashes, hostile takeovers, international litigation. It won't be undone by the paranoia of an overzealous junior staffer with a theory and a badge. He looked across the table. This is a moment for level heads. Let's not mistake self-righteousness for evidence. Imani didn't respond right away. She let the air settle, let the tension hold just long enough to make the silence work for her. Then, quietly, she placed a second folder on the table. It was thinner, marked with a single label. Board Correspondence Ethics Overrides. This one includes emails between certain board members and your office, she said. You used the phrase donor class insulation 3 times in one thread, and one of you replied with a laughing emoji. A low hum of shifting bodies swept across the room. Halvorsen turned visibly pale. Laura opened the second folder slowly, scanned a few lines, then closed it again. That one hasn't been submitted yet, Imani added. Not officially. Her eyes passed briefly across the table, pausing on Maddox. But if I walk out of here and you proceed with any version of the transition plan you mentioned earlier, then it goes live to FFEB, the DOJ, and the press. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. And just to be clear, this room is not protected under client confidentiality. That ended the moment you tried to make me the fall person. There it was. The collapse of certainty. The soft sound of power being dragged, inch by inch, off its pedestal. For the first time in the meeting, Maddox didn't have anything to say. And just like that, the others stopped waiting for him to say it. The silence didn't break with words. It broke with a vibration. Maddox's phone, face down beside his untouched folder, buzzed sharply against the wood. He glanced at it. Then again. The screen showed one name. He didn't answer. He flipped it over, silencing the call. But the moment had already cracked. Imani didn't move. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, hands calmly at her sides, letting the discomfort settle where it belonged. Across the table, Laura Chun adjusted her glasses, then spoke for the first time with full authority. I'd like to request a temporary recess, she said. And I'd like to speak with Ms. Russell and Mr. Maddox privately before we continue. Maddox leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. There is no need for that. But Reuben Stokes overrode him, not loudly, but with finality. There is, he said. His voice was rich, deliberate. Let's take 5. No vote. No debate. Chairs shifted, pages rustled, and one by one, board members rose, stepping out or quietly gathering at the far end of the room. Only 3 remained in place: Imani, Maddox, and Reuben. Maddox stayed seated, but something in his posture had changed. The lean had vanished. The confidence, too. He looked up at Imani, his tone almost hushed. You think they're going to side with you? You've made this a spectacle. They'll close ranks. You don't understand how this works. Reuben let out a low breath. She understands more than you think. He turned slightly toward Imani. What you did took time, strategy, restraint. You didn't come in here yelling. You came in prepared. Maddox scoffed. She came in to make a scene. No, Reuben said, eyes steady. You made the scene the day you decided her presence in this room was a threat instead of an asset. Maddox stood up now, finally, arms tight at his sides. You don't get it, do you? His voice cracked just enough to betray him. This is still my company. My name's on the charter. You think an anonymous audit and a few conveniently timed files are enough to bring me down? Imani took a step closer, not threatening, just sure. You're right. That wouldn't be enough. Which is why I didn't come here alone. She turned slightly toward the door. As if on cue, it opened. A tall woman in a dark blazer entered, followed by a second man holding a small case. Both wore badges, subtle, silver, and real. The woman nodded toward Reuben, then to Imani. Apologies for the delay. We've secured the archive servers. Confirmation has been transmitted to the Bureau. Maddox backed up a step. You brought them here? They've been here, Imani said. Since this morning. They waited until I gave the all clear. Reuben stood slowly, smoothing his jacket. Gregory, he said, his voice now layered with something heavier, older, final. You'll want to speak with counsel. Immediately. Maddox didn't reply. He was staring at the woman's badge now, his jaw tight, his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. The woman in the blazer stepped forward. We'll need access to the internal server room and Mr. Maddox's company-issued devices. Effective immediately. When no one moved, she looked toward Laura, who had just returned from the hallway. Counsel. Laura didn't hesitate. Authorized. Her voice was cool, clear. She turned to Imani and gave a slight nod. Not praise, not surprise, just acknowledgement. Outside the glass walls, a handful of executives had begun to gather in the hallway, peering through the frosted band that cut across the center of the room. Inside, Imani reached down, gathered the folders she had placed on the table, and straightened. She wasn't in a rush. There was no need to be. The room had already turned. Power had already moved. And the one person who tried to erase her from it now stood hollowed out in its center. Maddox sat back down, hard. For the first time in his career, his name didn't buy him time. His reputation didn't shield him. And his board no longer looked to him for direction. They were watching someone else now. Someone they had underestimated. Someone they almost removed. And Imani? She didn't need to say a word. The truth was already echoing without her. Gregory Maddox still sat at the head of the table, but the position no longer meant what it used to. The woman from the bureau stood silently near the door, her presence a quiet threat that needed no voice. Beside her, the man with the equipment case moved methodically, collecting devices, cataloging access points. Maddox tried to reassert himself with a glance. Chin up, jaw firm. But no one was meeting his eyes anymore. The board had scattered, not physically, but perceptibly. They were present but distant, watching, calculating. Some looked at Laura, some looked at Reuben, but none of them looked to him for what came next. Laura Chun turned a page in the second folder, her tone measured but unflinching. Gregory, you're to be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. All internal access points will be frozen. Your communications restricted. A temporary oversight committee will be formed under board discretion. Maddox opened his mouth, but his voice failed to follow. This is a mistake, he said finally. You're making a mistake. Reuben folded his arms. The only mistake would be not acting now. Then he turned to Imani. Do you have any further documentation that hasn't been submitted? Imani shook her head once. Everything is in the Bureau's possession now, and the rest is on record. She didn't need to say more. They all knew what that meant. Maddox stood, but it wasn't the kind of stand that commanded attention. It was the kind of stand that asked not to be forgotten. I built this firm, he muttered, more to himself than to the room. None of you would be sitting here without me. His hands shook slightly as he gathered the papers he had never read. No one stopped him. No one tried to honor the legacy he invoked. And as he moved toward the door, he hesitated, one last attempt at control, or maybe just a need to be acknowledged. But no one spoke. The woman in the dark blazer followed him out, her steps quiet but unrelenting. The door closed behind them with a whisper, not a slam. It didn't need to be loud. The weight had already shifted. Imani remained where she was. She didn't sit down. She didn't leave. She simply looked around the room as if seeing it for what it really was, for the first time and for the last. Laura finally broke the silence. Ms. Russell, she said, tone level. The board would like to extend an invitation for you to participate in the internal oversight process moving forward. Halvorsen, still pale, nodded faintly beside her. We'll need your help. Reuben looked over, not asking, not pressing, just letting space open. Imani considered for a moment. Then, with quiet finality, she replied, I'll stay as long as accountability remains the priority. But if this turns into a cleanup job, I'm gone. No one challenged her. No one flinched. The room knew she meant it. The conference space had changed. The walls hadn't moved. The table was the same. But something in the architecture of trust had been broken and rebuilt in silence. The young woman they had once dismissed as invisible was now the only one who couldn't be ignored. She walked slowly toward the chair Maddox had occupied. Not to sit, just to pause. Her fingertips brushed the back of the leather, and she looked down at it. Not with possession, but with clarity. Then she turned away, and walked back toward the window, where the light from the snow-covered city touched her shoulders like something earned. Outside the boardroom, the hallway had quieted. The small crowd of employees who had paused earlier had now dispersed. Some back to meetings, some pretending not to have seen anything at all. But the atmosphere had changed. It was in the way people moved, the way they lowered their voices, the way their glances lingered just a moment longer when Imani passed by. She didn't walk faster or slower. Her pace remained even. Not proud, not burdened, just steady. Like someone who had never been out of place here, even when others tried to make her believe she was. Behind her, the boardroom door clicked shut, sealing in the weight of what had unfolded. Inside, discussions would resume, policies would be re-examined, reputations quietly repositioned. But none of that concerned her now. What mattered had already been said, already shown, already proven. As she made her way down the corridor, Reuben caught up with her. He didn't speak right away. He just matched her stride, his presence unintrusive but intentional. After a few steps, he asked, You all right? Imani gave a small nod. I will be. He glanced sideways at her. You know what you did in there? It doesn't happen often. People don't usually stay that quiet for that long and still end up being heard. She let the silence stretch before answering. I wasn't trying to be heard, she said. I was trying to be clear. At the elevator, Reuben paused. If you ever want to do more than just audit what's wrong, if you ever want to build something better, there's space for that. Imani met his gaze. There was no invitation she hadn't already considered. But she understood what he meant. He wasn't offering her a favor. He was offering her ground. Thank you, she said. But first, some things need to finish burning before we try planting anything new. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside alone. As the doors began to close, Reuben lifted a hand. Not goodbye, just acknowledgement. a mirror of the nod she had received from Laura. Silent respect earned the hard way. Later that afternoon, Imani stood in front of a small group of junior analysts and operations staff in a quiet training room on the 10th floor. It hadn't been scheduled. She hadn't planned to speak. But when she saw them, wide-eyed, alert, and just nervous enough to second-guess themselves, she decided something needed to be said. "I want you to remember," she began, "that being underestimated isn't the worst thing that can happen to you in a place like this." She let the words land before continuing. "The worst thing is when you start to believe it." No one moved. No one typed. They just listened. There are systems in place designed to reward silence. They'll call it professionalism, discretion, patience. But silence, when it's used to survive injustice, will slowly teach you to disappear. And you don't need to disappear to keep your seat. A few of them nodded. One or two looked like they might cry. Imani didn't comfort them. That wasn't her role today. She was simply here to mark the moment. She closed her notebook, took a slow breath, and glanced once toward the tall window. The sun had shifted. It hit the tops of the buildings now, melting the snow in soft strips along the rooftops. When she turned back, she ended simply, "Speak when it matters. Document everything. And never forget you have more power than you think. Even if they don't see it yet." Then she walked out. Nothing dramatic. No applause. Just the sound of chairs creaking behind her as a room full of young professionals sat still, holding something new in their hands. The quiet shock of watching someone not just survive a system, but face it, expose it, and walk away whole.